Well, you want to do the interview with me, or what do you want to watch?
I'll do it with you.
Oh, you want to do it with me?
Well done.
Okay.
Eric, will you help me grill your daddy? Should we ask him some questions?
For decades, Simon Cowell was television's designated ice block. He built an entire career on saying the thing nobody else in the room was brave enough to say, on staring down nervous teenagers with a flat expression that told them exactly where they stood before he even opened his mouth. That was the brand. That was the money. And for a long time, it worked. Then, gradually, viewers started noticing something different. The same man who once cut a hopeful contestant off mid-note began sitting through entire performances in silence. He started tearing up at the golden buzzer instead of rolling his eyes at the theatrics. He looked, for lack of a better word, softer. And whenever a public figure changes that visibly, the internet does what it always does. It goes looking for a reason, and if it can't find a real one fast enough, it invents one. That's exactly what happened with the rumor claiming Cowell's young son, Eric, had been diagnosed with a serious illness. Over the past while, clips of Cowell looking emotional on set have been stitched together with ominous music, sad-sounding titles, and captions implying a private family tragedy. The story spread the way these things do, fast, and almost entirely without sourcing. There has been no statement from Cowell, no statement from Eric's mother Lauren Silverman, no hospital record, no interview, nothing from a credible outlet confirming any diagnosis involving Eric. Photos and video of him at public events, including recent appearances with his father, show an active, healthy child. When a claim this serious about a real child is circulating with literally nothing behind it except recut footage and a dramatic thumbnail, that's not breaking news. That's a content farm exploiting a celebrity's family for clicks, and it's worth saying plainly, it isn't true, and repeating it does real harm to a child who has no say in how his name gets used. So if Eric isn't the reason Cowell changed, what is? As it turns out, the real answer is sitting in plain sight, documented across years of interviews, and it's arguably a more interesting story than the rumor mill ever gave it credit for being. The performance that actually broke him. Rewind to 2017. A teenage dancer named Julia Carile walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage with her group, Mirza Girls, and told the judges something most contestants never have to say out loud: she had scoliosis, and doctors had told her the curve in her spine might eventually stop her from dancing altogether. She performed anyway. Cowell was visibly shaken by it, and unlike most emotional TV moments that end when the cameras cut, this one didn't end there. Cowell quietly arranged to pay for Julia to travel to the United States for a specialized surgery that wasn't going to be accessible to her family otherwise. Reporting at the time put the cost at roughly £175,000, covering 2 rounds of major surgery that ultimately cut the curve in her spine by roughly half. A year later, Julia returned to the BGT stage for the first time since the operations, and Cowell reportedly broke down in tears watching her dance again. This wasn't a scripted moment for ratings. It was a private financial commitment that took months to unfold, largely out of the public eye, for a teenager he'd met once during an audition. That single relationship changed something in how Cowell approached the show. People who watched him across those years started to notice the difference. He began letting performances run longer before jumping in with commentary, started asking contestants more about their circumstances instead of just their vocals or choreography, and stopped treating every audition as a pure showcase of marketability. Julia's story wasn't really about a diagnosis in the way the rumor mill wanted one. It was about what happens when a person known for detachment gets close enough to someone else's hardship that he can't stay detached anymore. Then his own body forced the issue. Julia's story cracked something open, but it took a second, far more personal event to actually rebuild the way Cowell lived. In August 2020, he was testing a new electric bike in the courtyard of his home in Malibu when he lost control and fell, breaking his back along with his arm. He later told interviewers he knew immediately what had happened the moment he landed. An X-ray afterward showed just how close the injury had come to leaving him unable to walk. He required a 6-hour surgery to fuse vertebrae and insert hardware to stabilize his spine, followed by months of recovery. He's since said he had no idea how unfit and rundown he'd let himself get until he was forced to rebuild basic strength from almost nothing during rehab. What makes this part of the story matter isn't the accident itself, it's what he said about why he pushed through the recovery as hard as he did. Cowell has repeatedly credited Eric, not fear or vanity, as the thing that got him moving again. Friends close to him at the time described him fixating on getting back to a version of himself that could keep up with a young, high-energy kid on the floor of their living room, rather than the version of himself that used to measure his worth in ratings. He's talked since about how playing football with Eric now genuinely exhausts him in a way it never used to, and how that gap between his son's energy and his own became its own kind of motivation to stay healthy. The therapy nobody expected him to admit to. Somewhere in that same stretch of years, Cowell also did something that ran directly against the persona he'd spent decades building. He started going to therapy. He's credited the isolation of the COVID-19 pandemic as the push that finally got him into a therapist's office, something he's said he wishes he'd done 10 or 20 years earlier. He's described the relief of it almost physically, like weight coming off his shoulders, and has talked about how disarming it was to sit across from someone whose job was to listen without judging him. For a man whose public identity for 20 years was built on judging other people for a living, that's not a small admission. It's arguably the clearest evidence that his softer public presence isn't a performance or a rebrand, it's the visible result of actual internal work. He's also opened up, more recently, about smaller vulnerabilities he used to hide entirely, including a stutter that flares up under stress, something he says most people who've watched him on television for years never picked up on. None of this reads like a man managing a family health crisis behind closed doors. It reads like someone slowly getting comfortable being seen as human instead of untouchable. What fatherhood actually did. Cowell has been fairly consistent, across interviews spanning several years, about what changed after Eric was born in 2014. Before his son arrived, he said his life was close to entirely consumed by work, long nights reviewing tapes, chasing ratings, living inside the job in a way that left little room for anything else. He's described Eric as the thing that finally pulled him out of that cycle, saying plainly that he no longer works through the night the way he used to and that he isn't sure what shape his life would have taken if his son hadn't come along. He's talked about switching to healthier eating habits, taking up regular exercise, and generally building a routine around a child's schedule instead of a production schedule. None of that requires a hidden diagnosis to explain. It's just what tends to happen when someone in their late 50s becomes a hands-on parent for the first time and realizes, gradually, that the version of success he'd spent his whole career building didn't leave room for the parts of life he now says matter most. It also explains the pattern people picked up on without being able to name it. A judge who once shut down performances mid-song now sits through them. A man who once treated vulnerability as a weakness on live television now visibly responds to it, and someone who used to plan every outcome with the precision of a business strategy now, by his own account, seems content letting his son simply be a kid rather than steering him toward a career in entertainment. That's not the behavior of a father bracing for bad medical news. It's the behavior of someone who's already been through his own version of a wake-up call, twice, in fact, once through Julia Carile's story and once through his own broken back, and came out the other side deciding to live differently. Why the rumor caught on anyway? None of this means the internet's instincts were completely wrong. Something clearly did happen to Simon Cowell. The mistake wasn't in sensing that a real shift had occurred, it was in assuming the only explanation dramatic enough to justify it had to involve a sick child. That's a pattern worth naming, because it isn't unique to this story. When a public figure changes in a way people can't immediately explain, speculation tends to fill the gap faster than facts can, and the version that spreads fastest is usually the saddest one, not the truest one. In this case, the real explanation was arguably more compelling than the fake one. A donor who quietly paid for a stranger's surgery, a man who nearly lost the use of his legs and rebuilt himself for his kid, and a public figure willing to sit in a therapist's office and admit he didn't know where to start. That's a harder story to compress into a 15-second clip with a sad piano track, but it's the one that's actually true. So the honest answer to what changed Simon Cowell isn't a secret diagnosis nobody's been allowed to talk about. It's a series of real, documented moments, a teenage dancer's spine surgery, a broken back on a bike he shouldn't have been testing without a helmet, a therapist's office he walked into out of desperation, and a son who apparently reordered his priorities just by needing him to show up. Eric Cowell, as far as any verifiable source shows, is a healthy 9-year-old boy who likes football and has no idea he's currently the subject of an internet rumor. His father, meanwhile, spent the better part of a decade quietly becoming a different person for reasons that have nothing to do with the story the algorithm decided to tell.